Good morning and welcome to Coffee with Ken, a thought leadership series at the nexus of business and politics. I'm Ken Biberai, your host. In the news today, according to leaked documents, China is preparing a supersonic drone spy unit, and Fox News and Dominion have settled a defamation lawsuit for $787 million. Today's topic is TikTok, China, and national security. We are joined by Jacob Helberg, who's a commissioner of the U.S.-China Economic Security Review Commission, as well as like 50 other cool titles, Jacob. So we're gonna dive in. But why don't we start there, actually, right? Like you have this amazing title, but you wear multiple hats, multiple different groups from Brookings and I think CNAS and so on. So tell us, how many hats do you wear? How are you spending your day? And it's great to see you.
It's great to see you, and thanks so much for having me. So, as you said, I'm service commissioner on the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. I'm also senior adjunct fellow at CNAS, and also senior advisor at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center.
Wow, and I feel like you live on an airplane these days, right? So, like as much as
I travel a lot these days.
Yeah, I probably don't track you as much as other foreign governments or other people are tracking you, but I mean. You're in Miami, you're in California, you're in DC, you're in New York. But it seems like today TikTok is top of mind for you, right? So fill us in, right? Like, what is the state of the situation with TikTok, and how and why is it at the center of this national security discussion that you're really trying to, I think, raise awareness on?
Well, TikTok is part of a broader American awakening that people are having with respect to China. I think one of the reasons why you're seeing public opinion shift so heavily in favor of taking action against TikTok is really for three reasons. The first and the heart of the matter is the data security issue, which is obviously the biggest issue that people take contention with TikTok. Under China's national intelligence law, the irrevocable fact is that Chinese companies have to hand over American user data to the Chinese government upon request. That is simply what Chinese law says in black and white. And I think what you saw during the hearing in Washington with the CEO of TikTok is no matter what Project Texas does, no matter what fancy firewall they put up, the law is the law. And Chinese law, this is a great example of Chinese law conflicting directly with American law. And so that's a major problem. So privacy and data security. The second issue is trade reciprocity. It's incredibly counterintuitive, I think, to most Americans. The fact that China doesn't allow any American content platforms in China, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, Google, GitHub, you name it, Netflix, they're all banned in China. Why are we allowing TikTok in the United States? Why are we providing them completely unfettered access to the American market and not demanding a basic level of trade reciprocity? Palantir CEO Alex Karp made this very point incredibly eloquently in a recent CNBC interview, and I tend to find myself in vehement agreement with him. And the third is the issue of organic free speech. We've had laws in this country for many, many years that prohibited the ownership by foreign governments of media companies, TV stations, and radio stations in the US. TikTok is arguably the biggest news station in the country at this point. It has over 100 million users in the US. 30% of them say that they get that TikTok is their primary source of news in the US. It's 30 million people. It's a lot of Americans getting their news from a platform that is believed to be rigged, quite frankly, to comply with China's content moderation and censorship laws. Try Googling for human rights atrocities against Uyghurs on TikTok. You're probably not going to find very much content. Try searching for terms like Winnie the Pooh and other topics that are contentious to the Chinese government. You probably won't find very much information. If you Google for things like racial injustice, if you search for terms that are defamatory towards the US government, I mean, TikTok's your app. It's full of those. The content on there consistently delegitimizes the US government and trust in American institutions. And so there are a lot of legitimate questions about whether it is healthy for our democracy to allow a foreign adversary government, which the DoD has labeled TikTok as an adversary government, own one of the biggest media platforms in this country.
So speaking of the kind of misinformation attacks, this is kind of predates TikTok for you, right? Like you personally saw this. after the 2016 election at Google. Talk a little bit about your own origin into this, right? Because I feel like TikTok's today where Jacob Helberg spends his time, but I feel like, clearly in your amazing book, The Wires of War, like it is shocking. Like we arranged this talk and then I read this and then I was like, oh, like TikTok's just going to be a small part of this because the magnitude and depth is really, I think, something most Americans aren't fully really aware of, right? So talk a little bit about your origin, and education and kind of, I guess, shock and awe about what's happening,
Yeah,
with
totally.
China, Russia, et cetera.
So I started my whole journey, as you say, on the policy team at Google. I spearheaded the company's efforts to combat foreign interference, which at the time was a new emerging issue. At the time, the primary focus was on Russia, but very quickly, China and to a lesser extent, Iran jumped on the propaganda bandwagon. When I say foreign interference, though, I want to be careful to really make it explicit that the core of my focus back then and the way that I define foreign interference today is specifically the instance when a foreign government is pretending to operate a local news state, platform in another country and is misrepresenting itself as a local news platform. So it's really about the misrepresentation piece. And the fact that it focuses on the pattern of behavior. I've never referred to foreign interference based on the content, so it doesn't matter what they're saying. It's really about how they're behaving and the fact that they're misrepresenting themselves. One of the things that I really noticed over time that caught my attention and that ultimately led me to focus on China was, as I focused on the issue of foreign interference, I started asking myself, the bigger picture issue of what are the big policy challenges that the tech industry was going to focus, 24 months down the line, 36 months down the line. And as I started thinking about the different ways in which foreign governments and governments generally were approaching technology, commercial civilian technologies, it became clear to me that they were starting to use commercial technologies as tools of geopolitics and frankly, as weapons. And that's when I realized that China and Russia were playing the same game, but using very, very different tools. So, they're both using commercial tech to advance their geopolitical purposes. Russia doesn't have major tech conglomerates. So, they resort to cheap, frankly, fairly low impact news outlets. China has major tech companies. It uses hardware. It uses Huawei and ZTE. And ultimately, that's where I developed this concept that we were in what I call a gray war that has two fronts, the front end and the back end. Russia was obviously the first mover on the front end. China is the primary mover on the back end, where it's trying to export its technology hardware to other countries, which then acts as a vehicle for Chinese laws, for Chinese influence and the like. And so ultimately, I grew incredibly alarmed at the implications that this would have for the sovereignty of countries that were taking in Chinese technology.
So if you think about the United States, I kind of think like one arm is the private sector, the other arm is the government, right? And I think just the more I've read your book and just, been studying up on this, it's shocking how one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing, or one thinks the other will be responsible for something. And I think this kind of misinformation, what Google's dealing with, what I think tech sector in Silicon Valley thinks Capitol Hill is dealing with, it's a striking disconnect. And it seems like they don't even speak the same language, right? So talk a little bit about that disconnect. You obviously made some news when you were back in Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago with a new organization called Hill and Valley, right? So that I think kind of gets to this thesis, but like how dramatic of a disconnect? Because on these talks, we've had so many of them, even with defense and aerospace companies where they're building technology and the federal government's like so far behind. And I think decades ago, there used to be more connectivity between even DoD and Silicon Valley, right? Like there was a connection. And it seems like over the last several decades, that disconnect has widened. And then with all this new information and innovation and social media and so on, that history was never even there from the beginning. So like, how challenging is this? And like the role you're trying to play, I think, kind of trying to educate policymakers. I mean, it seems like an uphill kind of, approach.
Yeah, so Silicon Valley has always had a bit of a libertarian streak to it.
Yes.
So Funny enough, in the days of the Arab Spring, there was actually something of a honeymoon between Silicon Valley
Sure.
and Washington. At the time, the ethos was that the internet was this inherently liberalizing force in the world that was freeing these countries from the grip of their authoritarian governments. Part of what I talk about in my book, The Wires of War, was actually the history of how, that honeymoon happened, the Arab Spring happened. Part of what happened after that honeymoon was you had the Snowden leaks, which was a huge blow to the relationship between Silicon Valley and Washington. And then you also had, because of the Arab Spring, China, Russia, Iran, all these authoritarian governments started racing to try to figure out how they could centralize their control over the internet in their countries in order to invert the paradigm of, instead of the internet empowering people, using the internet as a tool of political control and surveillance. And so you really had a paradigm shift, in the early to mid 2010s. And ultimately by 2016, you kind of saw this start to shine in full technicolor, because by 2016, most American content platforms were banned in China. And, you obviously had the Russian and the Iranian government that were already starting to use internet tracking as a tool to go after political dissidents. And so today you have a situation when, we're left with a relationship between Silicon Valley and Capitol Hill where there's a huge generational gap, in terms of just, these are individuals that came of age with drastically different life experiences. Yeah. A lot of people from Silicon Valley approach problems through the prism of, through an engineering mindset, whereas a lot of folks in Washington bring a legal background to their worldview. So there is a training difference, there is a generational difference, and it's a very different culture. Silicon Valley is very flat. Washington, as you know, is extremely hierarchical. So, very different communities. Nevertheless, they're two communities that are fundamentally in the business of building the future. And it's incredibly important to bring these two communities back together. And so that's part of the goal of the Hill and Valley Forum, is to create a space where you bring these communities together around the shared mission of advancing American national security against this incredibly serious and grave looming threat that is the Chinese Communist Party.
And I think a little kudos to you, and I'd love your thought on this, right? Like, I've seen tech executives testify in front of Congress, and then you kind of see these like almost comical questions coming from members of Congress. It seemed like during the TikTok testimony from their CEO, it seemed a little more sophisticated. The questions, the dialogue, the pressure from policymakers. You obviously spent time in the week ahead. How much of a role did you play? Like, were you happy with how that turned out vis-a-vis other situations and testimony in the past? I mean, was this part of the effort, I guess?
It absolutely was. I mean, one of the number one questions that elected officials in the House and in the Senate ask themselves when there's a big hearing or when a big bill comes up and they're being flooded with lobbyists is they ask themselves, who are our friends on this issue? And being able to show them that there are actually a lot of technically savvy people out there that genuinely share their concerns about the national security risks that TikTok poses, I think was very reassuring to a lot of folks on Capitol Hill. And I think it gave them the oxygen and the room to just go full throttle going into the testimony, expressing their authentic viewpoints, which was that nobody believes that Project Texas has any credibility or provides any meaningful reassurance. The fact is the fact, that is, the Chinese laws basically require Chinese companies to hand over their information, the user data that they collect, to the Chinese government. And no matter what TikTok does, it's not gonna, unless Chinese laws changes, it can't change that fact. And so ultimately, and that's not because of anything we did, the Chinese government is the one that chose to completely erase the dividing line between the public sector and the private sector in China. And so ultimately, Now it's incumbent on us to figure out what we're going to do to protect our sovereignty, our privacy, and our intellectual property.
So just do a few seconds on just like the magnitude of user data. Like I feel like people hear that, but they don't really appreciate it. Like I think people think it's just like, oh, I liked a couple of pictures, right? But once you download TikTok, once it's on your phone,
You're
like what is
injecting
the data?
you're injecting a piece of software on your phone. So it's not just what you do on the app, although that is true. So, let's divide, the data into two buckets. There's what you do on the app, which basically allows TikTok to build a detailed psychological profile of you, in terms of knowing what you get excited by, what you fear, what all of your different psychological fault lines are. If you're gay, if you're straight, if you're cheating on your spouse, you name it. It's also what you do off the app. So TikTok is an app that can collect all the pictures in your iPhotos folder. It can read your text messages. It's a piece of spyware on your phone that can detect your location 24/7, that can detect what you copy and paste on your phone through clipboard data, which for a lot of people is their username and passwords to a lot of their other email, credit card, you name it, accounts. So it's a lot of data. If you may not be concerned, you may not see the direct relevance as an ordinary citizen, but at scale, it's incredibly relevant. We could have a presidential candidate in this country, and if their kids are on TikTok, that presidential candidate all of a sudden has to worry about some foreign government over, for a foreign politician in Beijing having compromise about him, his family, his kids. You can have judges and journalists in this country that find themselves in the same situation. Or think about when China hacked the Office of Personnel Management and obtained the list of US government employees with security clearances. I mean, think about the risk that poses. If you have a list of everyone in the government with a security clearance, and then you could go out and find detailed information about them, it is absolutely not okay for a foreign government to get that level of access and detail into the lives of our citizens. And that is why we have a Fourth Amendment against unreasonable searches and seizures in the US in our Constitution. And ultimately, that amendment applies to the US government and should also apply to the Chinese Communist Party.
Are we at war with China and Russia today?
We are at war, and the reason is that war isn't binary, it's a spectrum. And so it's not you're either in this, fairy tale land of rainbows and puppies, or you're in an all-out, nuclear Armageddon. There is a middle ground. It's called asymmetric warfare. That's why I called it the Gray War. China's been at war with the US for a long time. They send shipments of fentanyl into this country. People in the IC and a growing number of people in the government, nobody believes that China is unaware of where this fentanyl is coming from in China and is directly for export to the United States. And it kills 100,000 Americans a year. They have engaged in a level of economic warfare that has eradicated 7 million manufacturing jobs, cost hundreds of billions in intellectual property theft. The list is so long, Ken. And ultimately, I find some level of reassurance that our government is starting to catch on and it's starting to take steps. But ultimately, we can't be playing the minors league. We have to adopt a wartime mentality to take radical steps to move the needle much faster on a lot of big policy issues.
So how far behind are we? How flat-footed are we? What are we doing right? Right? Like, talk about like our posture and our kind of current positioning as a U.S. government.
Directionally, we're going in the right direction. I mean,
but from how far behind, though, right? Like, I mean, I feel like this is like,
so this is the thing.
Going on.
This is the issue. Well, this is why I take issue with the concept of saying, "Oh, we're in a competition," because when you're in a competition, you can afford to go fast or go slow. You can afford to win or lose. The stakes aren't that high. We're at war. We're not in a competition. China doesn't want to simply live in a multipolar world. They want to live in a world where they dominate everyone else, including us. And so ultimately, this is about the survival of our economy, of our way of life, and our political system of democratic governance. And that is why I think a wartime mentality is what's needed
Mhm.
to go much, much faster. We know that we need an outbound CFIUS framework to restrict American capital going into China. We know that we need a data security law to restrict Chinese technologies, whether it's hardware or software, in the United States. We know that we need to revisit most favored nation status for China under US law. I, as you said at the beginning of this program, serve as commissioner on the US China Economic and Security Review Commission, which is responsible for reporting to Congress, among other things, whether China is complying with its WTO commitments. Every year since the founding of the commission, China has been found to not comply with its WTO commitments. The number of times it's complied is exactly zero. So at what point are we going to say that we're going to start to revisit most favored nation status under our laws that grant China the privileged access to our markets? So we know what a lot of basic elementary steps we should take are. We've been debating them. It's time to get that done so that we could finally get around to tackling the much bigger issues, like modernizing our national security apparatus to make sure that Taiwan has the weapons it needs to defend itself, like making sure that we can accelerate efforts with respect to reshoring semiconductor supply chains in the US. There's so many things that we need to do, but we need a sense of urgency to tackle this expeditiously.
So real quick, I mean, Tesla's thinking about building a massive factory in China. You have USVCs now that I think are looking for Chinese AI companies that are going to compete with ChatGPT and OpenAI, where like money here is still thinking about going there. So what is your kind of call to action there? What is your effort to kind of, push back on even the private sector domestically that's kind of maybe just focused on the bottom line?
So my response is, it is business people are going to do what they're going to do. They have to play within the lines of what's legal and not legal. It is in the preamble of our Constitution that a fundamental purpose of the US government is to provide for the common defense. So ultimately, it's the government's job to make sure that our rules of the road and our laws advance our own security. We can't expect American business leaders to start making discretionary judgments about what is consistent and inconsistent with America's national security. The government needs to do that. The government needs to take that responsibility because it is literally spelled out in our Constitution. And we keep getting heartbroken and disappointed when we see some of our most iconic businesses make these kinds of big investments in our number one geopolitical adversary. But the best way to put an end to this insanity is by passing an outbound CFIUS framework to restrict American capital going into China.
Interesting. Real quick, call to action, right? Like if you're an individual, if you're a policymaker, if you're a company, what's your kind of message to the spectrum of folks out there, right? Like what could individuals be doing? Is it they should be deleting TikTok? Should they be calling their member of Congress? Private sector, obviously you need government control, but like also they are in charge of making their own independent business decisions and planning for the future about reshoring, et cetera. So what's the kind of call to action as you navigate these waters? Because you've been in the private sector, you're now kind of in this, public role, right? You kind of get this stuff. So
yeah, I'd say my most all-encompassing call to action is whether you're in the private sector or the public sector is you need to understand that we're in a Cold War with China. Nothing less. And so if you're a business person, that means don't invest in China. It's a big world out there. India actually has more people than China. India surpassed China's population today. They're outperforming China from a GDP standpoint. And that's even if you believe China's fake GDP numbers, which everyone knows that they're totally rigged. Even by those official statistics, India's performing much better. So there are a lot of other attractive markets. Divest from China, look for other opportunities. If you're a policymaker, the logical implication of us embracing the fact that we're in a Cold War means you need to start passing bills and stop debating endlessly, waiting for that perfect, moment. The time to pass laws related to this is now because we have no time to waste. China is racing ahead with all kinds of different initiatives in critical technologies, and we just can't afford to lose. We need to run much faster.
Well, before I let you go, tell me about what's happening with the book. If you had to update an intro, or if you're thinking about writing a new one, what's on your mind? Where do you take this? This seemed to have been the first big step for you personally. So where are you headed on on that front? What's next for you?
Well, I'm thinking about writing a sequel, but I'm a little bit reluctant to discuss that in too much detail until I actually write it. I think if I had to, write an afterword for my first book, funny enough, when I wrote the first book, China wasn't that big of a player on front end related things. It was really more focused on, what I call back end initiatives, mainly hardware. So through Huawei and ZTE. Funny enough, I mean, with TikTok and, Temu and Shen, China's become probably the biggest player, has, far outperformed Russia on when it comes to content and media. And so now they're really an all encompassing technology threat to the US. It's front end, it's back end. And so we need to really appreciate, the magnitude of that and, all the implications that has for us.
Well, Jacob, thank you for a fascinating yet terrifying conversation this morning on Coffee with Ken. Appreciate everybody tuning in. As always, you can visit coffeewithken.com to catch up on past sessions. Our next conversation is going to be tomorrow with Lynn Martin, the president of the New York Stock Exchange. In the meantime, you can also catch us on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Google Play. Jacob, great seeing you, and look forward to catching up for real coffee in DC when you're here next. Take care.
Thanks for having me. I look forward to it as well.